My family has had a cabin on Lake Whittemore since before I was born. My grandfather bought the land in the late 60s when northern Minnesota lake property was still affordable for a working man. Cleared it himself, built the original cabin with help from his brothers over the course of 2 summers. By the time I came along, the cabin had been expanded twice, and the property had been in the family for 30 years. It was the fixed point of every summer, the place we went in late June, stayed for 2 or 3 weeks, and returned to as close to the same people we had been the previous summer as adults are ever able to manage. Lake Whittemore is not a large lake, about 2 miles across at its widest point, perhaps 3 miles long, surrounded by birch and pine that come right down to the shoreline in most places. The water is cold, even in late July, when the surface has had weeks of sun to warm it. The deeper sections stay cold enough to make you catch your breath. The lake bottom drops steeply about 30 feet from our dock. One moment you are standing in waist-deep water on sand, and the next, your feet find nothing and the bottom is 25 feet below you, invisible in the darker water. We called that section the deep end, the way you would call a section of a pool the deep end. It was not a threatening name, it was just what that part of the lake was. We swam in it every summer, dove from the dock into it. My cousins and I spent whole August afternoons out there on inflatable rafts doing nothing in particular. The deep end was part of the lake, the way the dock and the fire pit and the screen porch were part of the property. A fixture, a given, something that had always been there and would always be there. I am telling you all of this so that you understand what I mean when I say that what I saw in the deep end in the summer I was 22 was not something I could have imagined on my own. The lake was as familiar to me as any place on earth. I was not frightened of it, and I had no reason to be. That particular summer, I was at the cabin alone for a week before the rest of the family arrived. I had finished my 3rd year of university and wanted some time to decompress before the controlled chaos of a family summer began. My parents were fine with this. They knew I would take care of the place, open it up properly, air it out, get the boat running. I had done it with my father the previous few years and knew what needed doing. I arrived on a Saturday in late June. The drive up was 5 hours, and I got there in the early afternoon. Enough time to open the cabin, air out the rooms, check that the water system was running and that nothing had been damaged over the winter. The lake was glassy when I arrived. The kind of surface you only get before the afternoon wind comes up, reflecting the tree line and the sky so cleanly that it looked like you could reach down and peel it back like a membrane. I went for a swim before dinner, dove off the dock, swam out to the deep end, floated on my back for a while, watching the light change in the sky. It was one of those early summer evenings in northern Minnesota, where the light lasts so long it seems almost indulgent. The sun's still above the tree line at 8 o'clock, everything golden and still. I swam back to the dock and made dinner and sat on the screen porch reading until it was dark. The first thing happened 2 days later, on a Monday afternoon. I was swimming out to the deep end, not for any particular reason, just the way you swim when you have a lake to yourself and nowhere to be. The lazy, purposeless swimming of someone whose only job for the week is to exist at a lake. I reached the drop-off and trod water for a moment, looking back at the cabin, then turned and looked out across the open water. Something was in the lake, about 20 feet in front of me, just below the surface, at the depth where the bottom had dropped away, but the water was still clear enough to see into if the light was right. It was large. Not enormous, not a whale or anything that size, but large enough that my brain registered it before I had fully processed what I was looking at. A pale shape, indistinct at that depth, roughly horizontal, not moving, long. The rough dimensions of a person stretched out, but wrong in some way I could not immediately place. Too long, perhaps, or the proportions slightly off. I stopped swimming. I trod water and looked at it. The shape was not moving. It was not rising, not sinking, not drifting in any direction I could detect. It appeared to be simply there, suspended at that depth, in the clear, cold water below the drop-off. I told myself it was a log. Lake bottoms accumulate logs. They sink and become waterlogged and occasionally drift up to the surface or sit suspended at mid-depth for years. I had seen this happen before on other lakes, if not on this one specifically. A submerged log was a completely rational explanation for a pale, elongated horizontal shape in the water. I swam back to the dock without looking at it again. I got out, dried off, went inside, made a cup of coffee. I sat at the kitchen table and thought about the log explanation for a while. It held up to scrutiny in every way, except one, which was this. I had been swimming in that section of the lake in various conditions and at various times of day for my entire life. I had never seen anything like it there before. If a log had been sitting in the deep end of Lake Whitmore for years, I would have noticed it before now.
I did not go back into the lake that afternoon. The following morning, I was up early. The light in northern Minnesota in late June comes before 5, and the screen porch faces east, and once the sun cleared the tree line, it was bright enough in the cabin that sleeping became more effort than it was worth. I made coffee and took it out to the dock and sat with my legs hanging over the edge. The lake was calm again, that early morning glassy surface. I sat and drank my coffee and looked at the water. The deep end was about 30 feet from the end of the dock. In the early light, with the surface as still as it was, I could see down into the water from this angle. Not far, but enough. The shape was still there. I could see it clearly from this angle in the still water, more clearly than I had from above while swimming. It was still horizontal, still pale, still in the same position relative to the drop-off. And in the early morning light, with my eyes adjusted and the water undisturbed by any wind or movement, I could make out details I had not been able to see the day before. It had a face. I want to be as precise as I can about what I mean by that, because I know how it sounds, and I do not want to be imprecise about something this significant. I am not saying that I saw a clear, detailed human face in the water. What I am saying is that the upper portion of the shape had features consistent with a face, the general arrangement of lighter and darker areas where eyes and a mouth and a nose would be, the overall ovoid shape of a human head at the top of the elongated form. I sat on the dock and looked at it for a long time, long enough for the light to change and for a slight breeze to come up off the water and disturb the surface enough that I could no longer see clearly into the deep end. I called my father. It was early enough on a weekday that he had not yet left for work. I told him what I was seeing. He was quiet for a moment and then asked me exactly where in the lake it was positioned. I described it as precisely as I could. He was quiet again for a little longer this time. Then he told me something he had never told me before. He said that in the winter of 1987, before I was born, a man had gone through the ice on Lake Whitmore while ice fishing alone. He had been using a section of the lake near our dock, the drop-off area that we called the deep end. His body had never been recovered. The lake was searched, but the depth and the cold and the current that ran through the deep section had taken him somewhere beyond finding. My father said he had not told me this when I was younger because he did not want to change the way I felt about the lake. He said he thought about it sometimes, in the summers, when he was out on the dock. I stayed at the cabin for the rest of the week as planned. I did not go back into the water. On the day my family arrived, and my mother and my aunts and my cousins piled out of their cars, and my youngest cousin ran straight for the dock to jump in, I stood at the edge of the property and watched the deep end. The water was choppy that day. Wind from the north, the surface broken into small waves that caught the afternoon light. I could not see anything below the surface. I have not been able to see into the deep end clearly since then. I go back to the cabin every summer. I swim off the dock. I stay on the shallow side of the drop-off, and I do not think about what my father told me,
or not more than briefly, not more than a few times each day. Some things you learn to live alongside. The deep end is still the deep end. The water is still cold. The light in late June still lasts longer than it has any right to, and the lake still looks like something you could peel back on still mornings when no one else is awake. I want to begin by saying that I am an experienced camper. I grew up in Oregon and have been camping in the Cascades since I was a child. I have camped solo, in groups, in designated sites, and in backcountry areas that require permits and bear canisters, and the kind of preparation that makes casual campers nervous. I know how to read weather, how to hang food, how to navigate with a paper map. I have slept alone in the wilderness in conditions that would surprise most people and felt nothing more threatening than the ordinary mild anxiety that is appropriate when you are a small animal sleeping in a large forest. What happened at Site 14 in the summer 3 years ago is the only camping experience in my life that I would describe as genuinely frightening. Not uncomfortable, not unusual, not the kind of story that is interesting to tell around a fire. Frightening. The kind of frightening that changes the way you sit in relation to the tree line when you are alone at a campsite after dark. The campground was a mid-level Forest Service site in the Cascade Range. Not the big ones with flush toilets and electrical hookups, but not primitive either. Pit toilets, a water pump, fire rings, numbered sites spaced far enough apart that you had reasonable privacy. I had reserved Site 14 for 3 nights in early August. I was going alone. My usual camping partner had a family commitment, and I had already taken the days off work and was not willing to cancel what had become, in the preceding years, a ritual I considered important to my mental health. I arrived on a Friday afternoon. The campground was maybe a third full. Summer weekends bring people out, but this was not a particularly popular or well-known site, and the crowd, such as it was the usual mix of families with children, a few groups of young adults, a couple of older pairs who moved through their camp routines with the efficiency of long practice. Site 14 was at the end of the loop road, which I had specifically requested because it meant fewer neighbors and less ambient noise. It backed up against a dense stand of old-growth Douglas fir, the trees enormous and close together, their canopy high and continuous enough that the light in the forest behind my site was already shifting toward dusk by mid-afternoon. I set up my tent, organized my gear, gathered wood from the pile near the road, and made dinner before dark. Standard arrival routine. I ate and washed up and had a cup of tea sitting in my camp chair, watching the fire burn down and the light fail in the treetops. This is my favorite part of camping. The transition from day to night. The way the forest sounds different as darkness settles, the fire becoming the center of the world. I went to bed at 10. The site was quiet. The nearest occupied sites were perhaps 150 feet away, and the sounds from them, voices, music, the occasional burst of laughter, had faded by 9:30. I awoke up at 2:17 in the morning. I know the time because I checked my watch immediately, the way you do when something wakes you and you are trying to orient yourself. I was awake with the complete suddenness of someone who has heard something, rather than the gradual surfacing of a natural sleep cycle. Whatever had woken me, I was fully alert before I had consciously decided to be. I lay still and listened. The forest was quiet in the way forests are quiet at 2 in the morning. Not silent, but organized around natural sounds. The wind in the high canopy, something small moving in the duff near the tent, an owl somewhere to the east that had been calling intermittently since I went to bed. Then, I heard what had woken me. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, on the dry pine needles and leaf litter around my tent. Heavy enough to be a large animal or a person, moving in a circuit around the tent rather than passing through. Not the straight line movement of something crossing my sight on its way elsewhere. but a slow circumnavigation, close enough that I could hear each step clearly. I lay still. My first thought was bear, which is the correct first thought in the Cascades when you hear something large and slow moving around your campsite at night. I did not have food in my tent. It was all in my car, which I had parked 20 feet from the tent. I had followed every protocol. If it was a bear, it would find nothing of interest at my tent and move on. I listened to it walk around the tent. Once, twice, slow, even, unhurried. Not the shuffling investigation of a bear sniffing for food. More regular than that. More deliberate. On the third circuit, it stopped. On the side of the tent nearest the tree line, about 3 feet from where my head was lying, the footsteps stopped. I could not hear breathing. The wind in the canopy was enough to mask anything that quiet, but I could feel, in the specific physical way that the body registers proximity, that something was there, 3 feet from my head, on the other side of 6 millimeters of tent fabric, not moving. I reached slowly for the bear spray I keep in my tent in an accessible side pocket. My hand found it. I held it and lay still. Whatever was outside the tent did not move for a long time. My watch said 4 minutes when I checked it, though it felt considerably longer than 4 minutes. 4 minutes of total stillness, 3 feet from my head, in the dark.
Then the footsteps resumed, moving away from the tent this time, toward the tree line. I could hear them getting quieter, the specific way footsteps on dry debris get quieter with distance. And then they were gone, and the forest was quiet again, except for the wind and the owl. I did not sleep again that night. I lay in my sleeping bag with the bear spray in my hand and watched the tent walls for the gray light that meant morning. At first light, I got up and looked at the ground around my tent. There were tracks. I'm not an expert tracker, but I have spent enough time in the backcountry to know what deer tracks look like, what bear tracks look like, what the disturbance patterns of various animals look like in soft ground. The tracks around my tent were not any of those. They were boot prints, human boot prints, adult-sized, circling the tent 3 times with the same even spacing I had heard in the night, then leading away toward the tree line and disappearing where the ground became harder under the trees. I broke camp that morning and left. I drove the 2 hours back to Portland without stopping. I filed a report at the Forest Service ranger station on my way out, describing the tracks and the approximate time. The ranger who took my report asked if anything had been taken or if I had been approached directly. I said no to both. He said they would note it and increase patrol frequency in that area. He gave me a card and told me I had done the right thing by leaving. I have not returned to that campground. I have returned to the Cascades. I said it was a ritual and I meant it, and I was not willing to let one night take that from me entirely. But I now camp with another person, always. I do not take end-of-loop sites that back up against dense forest, and I do not lie awake listening to something circle my tent, because I am never in a position where I have to. The boot prints were the part I keep coming back to. Not the sound in the night, not the 4 minutes of stillness outside the tent wall. The boot prints, deliberate, evenly spaced, circling and circling. Whatever it was not curious. Whatever it was not passing through. It came to Site 14 at 2 in the morning with a specific intention. And the only reason I can say what I did in the morning and sit here now and tell you this is that it apparently decided, after 4 minutes of standing 3 feet from my head in the dark, that whatever that intention.
I grew up 20 minutes from the beach, not one of the famous ones, not the Gold Coast or Noosa or anywhere with a surf school on every corner. Just a long stretch of North Queensland coastline that locals used and tourists mostly didn't know about. Wide, pale sand, water that went from turquoise close in to deep blue further out. The kind of beach that looks like a travel poster and is actually just where you grew up, so you mostly take it for granted. I had been surfing since I was 11. Nothing serious. I was never going to compete, never had the commitment or the talent for it, but competent, comfortable in the water, aware of the conditions in the way that anyone who has grown up swimming in the ocean from childhood tends to be. I knew how to read a rip, I knew what an undertow felt like and what you were supposed to do when you caught one. I knew this beach specifically in all of its seasonal moods, the winter swells that made it worth surfing, the summer flatness that made it good for nothing except swimming and lying on the sand. This happened in January, which is deep summer in Queensland. I was 22 at the time, back home for a few weeks between semesters at university in Brisbane. A mate of mine, I'll call him Dean, had a beach house that his family owned in the small town near the beach I'm describing, and every summer a group of us would descend on it for a week or 10 days of doing very little in a beautiful location. That summer there were 5 of us, me, Dean, 2 other mates from uni named Will and Pete, and Dean's younger sister, Kara, who was 19 and had been hanging around our group since she was 15 and was at this point as much a part of the summer ritual as the house itself. The beach was a 20-minute walk from the house. We went every day, usually in the afternoon when the worst of the heat had passed, walking down through the scrub path that opened onto the sand about halfway along the beach's length. The beach was usually quiet, a few families close to the car park at the southern end, the occasional fishermen on the rocks at the north point, sometimes nobody at all in our section. It was on the 4th day of that week that something happened that I have not spoken about publicly until now. It was late afternoon, maybe 4:30. The 5 of us had been at the beach for a couple of hours. Will and Pete had already headed back to the house. Will had caught too much sun, and Pete went with him for the company. Dean was asleep on his towel. Kara was reading. I had gone back into the water for a last swim, the kind of swim you have when you know you are leaving soon and want to make the most of the remaining time. The water was flat that day, no real swell, barely any wind, the surface moving only with the slow, deep breathing of the ocean in calm conditions. I swam out past the sandbar, maybe 80 meters from shore, and trod water for a while, looking back at the beach. From that distance, Dean's figure on the towel was small, and Kara was barely visible against the sand. The beach to the north and south stretched empty in both directions.
I turned and looked out to sea. This is something I always did, floating out past the sandbar and looking out at the open ocean, the unobstructed horizon, the sense of what was out there. It is one of those things that is difficult to explain to someone who has not done it. The quality of attention that the open ocean demands when you are in it rather than beside it. Something was in the water with me. About 15 meters further out, beyond where I was treading water, in the darker section where the bottom had dropped away further, something broke the surface. Not dramatically, not a splash or a breach, just a disturbance, a displacement, the way the surface moves when something large passes just below it. A smooth upwelling, a circular disturbance about 2 meters across, and then the surface settled back. I stopped moving. I trod water and watched the spot. Nothing for a full minute. The surface calm, undisturbed, the same slow, deep breathing of the flat sea. Then it happened again, a different spot, about 5 meters to the left of the first one. The same smooth upwelling, the same circular disturbance, the same settling. Something below the surface, large enough to displace that amount of water, moving slowly. I want to be precise about the scale of the disturbance because I think it matters. These were not small movements. The diameter of each upwelling was roughly 2 meters. To displace that amount of surface water from below requires something with significant mass. I am not a marine biologist, but I have been in this ocean since I was a child, and I have never seen a disturbance of that size and character that I could attribute to anything I was familiar with. I began swimming back toward shore, not panicking,
I have mentioned I knew how to manage fear in the water, and panic in the ocean is how people die, but purposefully, with the specific calm efficiency of someone who has made a decision and is executing it. Steady strokes, even breathing, not looking back. I was about halfway to the sandbar when something touched my foot. I am going to be precise about this too, because it is the detail that I have had to think about most carefully in the years since, the one I have gone over most often to make sure I am describing it accurately. It was not a brush, the accidental light contact of something passing near you in the water. It was a grip, brief, lasting perhaps 1 second, and then let go. My left foot at the ankle, a pressure that encircled it completely in the way that a hand would encircle it, and then it let go.
I did not stop swimming. I did not look back. I covered the remaining distance to the sandbar and then continued to shore without pausing at the sandbar and walked out of the water at the shoreline and stood on the sand, breathing. Dean had woken up. He looked at me from his towel and asked if the water was good. I said yes. I picked up my towel and dried off. I sat down in the sand. Kara looked up from her book. She said, "You okay? You look a bit white." I said I was fine. I had gone out further than I meant to. I did not tell either of them what had happened. I told myself on the walk home that it had been a fish, a large fish that happened to brush against my foot in a way that felt like pressure. The ocean is full of large fish, and I had swum in this ocean for years, and there was a first time for every kind of contact, and this was probably just that. I have continued to tell myself this in the years since. It is a reasonable explanation. It is the explanation I would give you if you asked me directly what touched my foot, if we were having a casual conversation about swimming. But I know the difference between being brushed by something passing and being held. My body registered it as a grip before my brain had time to interpret it, in the way that the body registers things accurately before the brain begins its work of making them manageable. It held my foot for 1 second, and then it let go. I have thought often about that letting go, about whether it was accidental or deliberate, about whether whatever was below me in the dark water of the North Queensland coast on a flat January afternoon made a decision when it released my foot, and if so, what that decision was. I still go to the beach. I still swim. I grew up 20 minutes from the coast, and the ocean is part of who I am, and I am not willing to give that up because of one January afternoon. But I do not swim alone anymore, and I do not go past the sandbar. And when I tread water and look out at the horizon, and the surface of the ocean moves in that particular way, that smooth, circular upwelling, that displacement without explanation, I begin swimming back toward shore immediately with the calm efficiency of someone who has made a decision, and I do not look back.
You shouldn't be here unless you've already subscribed to Dr. Nightmare.